Welcome to today's webinar, Evaluating Social Emotional Learning Skills, brought to you by Simple K-12. My name is Lori and I'm here with Paul LeBuffe, and we are so excited to have all of you here with us today. Now, this webinar is brought to you free today thanks to our sponsor, Apperson. At Apperson, our mission is to maximize potential. We advance educational professional development by providing innovative services and solutions designed to assess performance and measure success. We deliver exceptional customer service driven by our core values of integrity, passion, respect, and teamwork. This results in greater knowledge and enriched outcomes for students, teachers, and business leaders alike. Now, for those of you who are joining in live, I just went ahead and sent out a tweet from our Twitter account. You can feel free to retweet to your followers and invite them to attend today's session that is free and open to the public. Thanks to our friends at Apperson. Just be sure to include this link as well as the hashtag SK12 when you send out your tweet. Once again, we do have that live back channel chat open. Great place for you all as attendees to take notes and chat. 100% optional. Don't feel obligated to join in, but it is a lot of fun. I went ahead and sent that link out through the chat area, GoToWebinar, and I'll go ahead and resend that again in just a couple of moments. And we will have some time for some live Q&A at the end of our session today with Paul. Feel free to submit your questions through that questions box of GoToWebinar. Now, it does tend to auto-collapse, but if you click on that orange arrow, the question box will open and you can type in your question. Now, a little bit about our presenter. Paul LeBuffe holds a master's degree in experimental psychology from Bryn Mawr College and is the director of the Devereaux Center for Resilient Children in Villanova, Pennsylvania. Now, since the mid-1990s, his career has focused on the measurement and promotion of resilience in children and the adults who care for them. Now, Paul has authored numerous widely used assessments of behaviors related to children's social and emotional strengths and needs, and he has also presented to audiences throughout the United States and Canada on promoting resilience in children, youth, and adults. Paul, it's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you very much, Lori. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with all these folks from all over the country and even some countries outside the United States. So thank you all very much for joining me this afternoon. All right, so as you know, what we're going to be talking about this afternoon is how we can evaluate social and emotional learning skills. So my good colleague Cheryl Harmer in the previous session talked about the importance of social and emotional skills for student success in school and life, and in this particular session we're going to be talking about how we can measure and evaluate those social and emotional learning skills. So our goals for this session, we have two. The first is to talk about ways in which assessment can be used to improve student outcomes. We began our work at the Devereaux Center for Resilient Children with looking at children in preschool programs. And one of the major professional organizations within the preschool world is the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is interestingly known as NAEYC on the East Coast, but NIAC on the West Coast. And NAEYC, when we began our work, had this great standard that said that the reason you do assessments is to lead to improved outcomes for students. And I just want to emphasize right from the start, that's what we're going to be talking about today, is how can we utilize assessment to help us achieve better outcomes for the students in our class. So that's our first goal. Our second goal is going to be to introduce the DESSA comprehensive system and Apperson's EVO SEL platform. So for a little clarification there, the DESSA is the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment, which is a nationally normed assessment of social and emotional skills in children currently in grades K through 8. And then Apperson is our publishing partner, and they have provided the online web-based EVO SEL platform, which is one of the main ways in which we deliver the DESSA comprehensive system to schools in the United States and countries outside the United States. So you may have seen these bracelets before that say, "Just let me teach." Many teachers may be wearing these as a bit of a pushback to the emphasis at the moment on high-stakes testing. And again, I just want to say what we're talking about today is not high-stakes testing. It's not accountability. It's using information to help us achieve better outcomes for the students in our classes. Now, Cheryl talked a little bit in the previous session about the importance of evidence-based social and emotional learning curricula. And we certainly encourage the use of these SEL curricula because Using a good social emotional learning curriculum is going to ensure uniformity across the classes, across the entire school building, perhaps across the district. It's also going to ensure that we have good coverage of those essential social emotional skills. And of course, the best social emotional learning curricula also reflect evidence-based best practices. But I'm going to suggest that we really should also consider utilizing assessment even if we're using the social emotional learning curriculum. Often that implementation of these curricula is not informed by assessment, and as a result, we don't really get to reflect on what are the real specific areas of need in the social emotional domain for the students in my classroom. And so our implementation doesn't reflect those areas. We also may not be aware of the strengths that the students in our classrooms have. And if we're not aware of them, then we can't leverage those within our program. And lastly, if we're not looking at our outcomes, then our implementation is uninformed by those outcomes and remains unchanged from year to year, so there's no real ongoing quality improvement or continuous quality improvement within that program. So these are some of the ways we're going to be talking about using assessment. I also want to think about the kind of assessments we want to use. Unlike many other assessments, the DESSA is a strength-based assessment, nationally normed, very heavily researched, but it focuses on student strengths. And I think it's important that we think about the kinds of assessments we use because the questions we ask on these assessments communicates to the school community, to the students, and to their parents what values we have. If all we look at are challenging behaviors in kids, and we're not looking at their strengths, that's communicating something to them about what we value and prioritize. We've also learned that just the act of filling out a strength-based assessment can really change how we view the student and can make us honor and recognize the strengths that they may be bringing to our classroom. And lastly, of course, is going to shape our communication with the students, with the parents, and with their peers. I mean, how great it is, particularly with students in special education, to be able to sit down with them and their parents and talk about these children's strengths rather than the more common topics of the challenges that they're having in our classrooms. So we want to do assessments, we want to think about the kinds of assessments we're going to use, but I think we also need to be cognizant of what we call the 3 R's of quality assessments. The first is it has to be rigorous, meaning it has good properties. Unfortunately, there are some assessments out there that are not well developed, and if they're not well developed, they're not going to give you the best information to help you arrive at the best decisions regarding the children in your classroom. So they've got to be rigorous, good validity, reliability, good standardization samples. But they also have to be reasonable in terms of their cost, in terms of the amount of time it requires of the teacher, and also in terms of the amount of training that it requires to use it professionally. And lastly, it's got to be relevant. It's got to address meaningful, important dimensions of student competency. So rigorous, reasonable, and relevant. We believe that the DESSA meets those 3 criteria. That's what we had in mind when we developed it. So today what we want to focus on in the rest of the session is how the DESSA and similar assessments can have relevance for teachers and administrators. And we're going to look in turn at screening, assessment, how it can be used to inform instruction, to monitor progress, and to evaluate outcomes. But keep in mind, in all of this, our overall goal is to support intentional teaching to lead to improved outcomes for the students. So let's begin by talking about screening. So the DESSA system has a component called the DESSA-mini. And the DESSA-mini is actually 4 equivalent 8-item forms that can be used to screen on a universal basis social and emotional competence of all the children in your classroom, your school, or potentially even your district. When we developed the DESSA-mini, our goal was to have a well-developed, reliable assessment or a reliable screener that can be completed in about 1 to 2 minutes by teachers. Our thinking here was, given the importance of social and emotional competency, but also being aware of all the other demands placed on teachers, what is a reasonable expectation for a teacher to spend in screening social and emotional competency? And we figured if you can screen all the children in your classroom in 1 planning period, that seemed to be a reasonable request. So given that, we decided that the DESSA-mini had to be completed in about 1 minute per student. Like most screeners, it's going to yield 1 score called the social and emotional total, or SET. The DESSA-mini is available both in paper and also web-based administration through the EVO platform, and it's available in English and Spanish. This is what the paper version looks like. It's very familiar to teachers. We ask them to think about the child's behavior in their classroom over the past 4 weeks, and then to look at these 8 different strength-based statements here, things like do something nice for somebody, contribute to group efforts, follow the advice of a trusted adult, and think during the past 4 weeks, how often have you seen the child do this? And then to respond never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, or very frequently. We then compare that child's score to a national normative sample of thousands of children, and we're able to identify how that child's social-emotional competence compares to other similar children. We report these scores as T-scores and percentiles, but we also suggest these descriptive terms for these T-score ranges. So being a strength-based score or a strength-based scale, high scores are desirable. So high scores, T-scores of 60 or above, we like to use the term strength to characterize that level of performance. Scores in the middle we refer to as typical, so a child be showing a typical amount of social-emotional competence. But most importantly, low scores, we like to use the term need for instruction. So think about that. We're not saying the child has a deficit or a problem. We're saying this child has a need for assistance, a need for instruction in the social-emotional domain. And in our national standardization sample, we find about 16% of students generally fall in that need for instruction range. So one of the ways that you can use the DESSA-mini and universal screening is to compare your classroom or your school to those national norms. And in this particular pie chart, which is similar to the kinds of results you would get from the EVO platform, we see that 24% of the students scored in the need range. That's actually 50% more than we would expect and would indicate that we really have a need for a good social emotional curriculum and other kinds of supports within our school. So that's a little bit about the DESSA-mini. Like most screeners, these results can then lead to assessment for those children, in this case the 24%, who need additional instruction. Well, what areas do they need instruction in? So now we're going to turn to the DESSA, which is our assessment of social emotional skills. So here we're assessing social emotional competence of children in grades K through 8. We are currently working on the high school version, should be out in about a year. The DESSA, the full assessment, has 8 scales, which are based on the CASEL framework, which Cheryl referred to earlier. 72 items that can be completed by parents and teachers, and also importantly, after school and community program staff. So if you work in an out-of-school time program, we developed the DESSA-mini and the DESSA to support you in your important work as well. Being longer, the DESSA, the full DESSA, is going to take about 8 minutes to complete. Again, it's available in English and Spanish and in paper and web-based versions. These are the 8 different scales. You'll recognize these from Cheryl's presentation earlier: self-awareness and self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, goal-directed behavior, personal responsibility, decision-making, optimistic thinking. If you miss Cheryl's presentation, these are the skills that research would indicate that students need to succeed in your classroom, but also in the community and eventually in the workplace. So this is what a profile of a DESSA score might look like. So we have our strength range indicated here in gray, and we can see the student has one definite strength in social awareness. But we also see a couple of needs in the areas of optimistic thinking and self-awareness. Now, many assessments stop at this point, and they give you a T-score. Maybe they identify the range that the child falls into. But we would like to give you more information to help you actually plan strategies to help this child. So in addition to the T-score, and I'm going to direct your attention to self-awareness here, one of the areas where this child has a need for instruction, we're actually going to drill down to the individual items. So here are 3 items from that scale, and what we've done is we have identified, based on our national standardization sample, what is an unusually low score on these items indicating a need for instruction on that specific behavior. What is a typical score indicated by a white box, which is what about 68% of kids received. And then these hexagons here actually indicate an unusually high score. And we have this item by item, and you can see it changes a little bit from item by item. The student whose profile I just showed you, when we go in and look at the self-awareness items, we see that he frequently asks for feedback. So even though in general he has a need for instruction in this area, this is a self-awareness skill that he's doing just fine in. So that's not something we'd want to focus on. Similarly, he frequently gives an opinion when asked, which is a typical behavior for kids in grades K through 8. But when we look at the item, teach another person to do something, we see he rarely does this. So the point here is this is going to help us direct our attention to the specific social emotional skills that this child needs to develop further and needs your assistance in developing. So we all know as teachers, right, that you really can demonstrate your knowledge of a given topic or area if you can teach that to somebody else. So by helping this child learn to teach something to another person is going to help him better recognize what his own unique strengths are. So this individual item analysis helps us make the transition from assessment scale T-scores to actually doing the interventions to help support the child. We can also take those individual profiles and aggregate them across our entire classroom. So here these letters indicate our 8 social emotional skills. Each child in this report from the EVO system is a row. A blue cell indicates that the child received a typical score in that area. A green indicates a strength, and a red indicates a need for instruction. So this first child had typical scores across all dimensions. This child, CY, we can see has a number of needs in the social emotional domain. This child here, HL, appears to be a social emotional superstar. So we can look across the rows and get the same information that we had in our social emotional individual child profile. But here we can also look at columns and see how our classroom is doing across each of these different domains. So the question becomes, how can we use these data to improve outcomes for our classroom? So if I have limited time to spend on social emotional direct instruction, I can see that in the area of decision making, this column here, DM, every one of my students is doing fine. They're all in the typical range. Here in social awareness, I actually have 6 students who have a demonstrated strength in that area, only 1 student who has a need for instruction. However, when I look at optimistic thinking or social awareness, I see I have 5 students who have a need in that area. So I can use this information to help me identify which particular social emotional skills I might want to emphasize a little bit more, or if I'm using a curriculum where I might want to spend a little bit more time. Similarly, I can use this information to help me plan for pull-out groups, particularly if I'm a school counselor. So I might say, you know what, I want to do some sessions on optimistic thinking, and I want to involve these students who have a need in that area, plus maybe a couple students whose scores are verging on the need, like JA here at a T-score of 42. Remember, 40 and below indicates a need. So I can identify kids for pull-out groups. I can also use this to help me assign learning partners. So this student here, EE, who had a need in social awareness, maybe I'd want to pair that child up with student HL, who has a demonstrated strength in that area, to do some peer-mediated learning. And if I'm a mentor teacher, or I'm a principal, or somebody in charge of curriculum and instruction, you can see that I could utilize this classroom profile to help my teacher better understand the needs of his or her classroom, and maybe give them some coaching in areas like how do we support optimistic thinking or social awareness. So here again, we're talking about using assessment results to inform practice to lead to better outcomes. Next, we're going to talk about informing instruction, but we're going to do that in the next session, which will focus on strategies. I want to turn our attention now to monitoring progress. So we're all familiar with the notion of response to intervention. We know this has been really successful in preventing academic failures in core academic subjects. We know that social emotional competency is a very important set of skills for kids to have. So why wouldn't we want to take the same approach, response to intervention, with the social emotional domain? The core components of a response to intervention approach are universal screening, which we have with the DESSA-mini, classroom-based interventions, which we will show you in the next session with the DESSA EVO SEL platform, and the last part is frequent monitoring of progress. So we've also developed a tool, which is part of the DESSA comprehensive system and available through the EVO platform, that allows us to monitor progress across time. And this is what that tool looks like. This is called the Ongoing Progress Monitoring Form. And it allows us to compare 4 different DESSA-minis. Remember, there are 4 different forms across a school year. So this student began with a score that was well down in the need range. We implemented some social and emotional instruction. We see by December 18th, when we did DESSA Form 2, that his score is improving, and we continue to implement those scores until by March, the score on the DESSA-mini is now actually back in the typical range, and by the end of the year, we can see that he's solidly back in the typical range. So this would be a very good response to intervention. We have some rubrics that we go into in the manual and in more in-depth trainings on how you can judge the amount of change between adjacent points as indicating no progress or small, medium, or large progress. And we have guidance on what to do in each of those circumstances. So I just wanted to introduce this form that gives us teachers a way of monitoring progress in acquiring social emotional skills across the year using a response to intervention format. The last thing we want to talk about in this brief webinar is how we can utilize this information to evaluate outcomes and also to improve the quality of our programs across time. So here, when we're talking about outcomes, we're using a pre-test, post-test comparison, comparing an earlier administration of the DESSA with a later administration of the DESSA. There's a statistical technique called the standard error prediction, which we use to compare those two scores to see if there's actually been reliable change in the scores. The notion here is we don't want to over-interpret small changes. We want to make sure that the change we're seeing is big enough to be statistically reliable and indicate that something important has really happened here. We can then use this information to evaluate how effective our strategies have been in supporting the child, and you'll see in a moment how we can then aggregate that information across classrooms, across entire schools, or even districts to help us understand where we should allocate our professional development resources leading to continuous quality improvement or CQI activities. So this is kind of, in a nutshell, what it looks like. This is one student's scores on the DESSA earlier in the year, in actually October, and then later in the year, in this case in February. So based on the time one score, using that standard error prediction, we can identify a range of scores that the post-test score could fall into, representing nothing more than chance variation. In other words, if you have a score of 58, the score could fluctuate between 50 and 65 at post-test just due to chance or error variance. So the notion here is that to show improvement, the score actually has to be above this range. The post-test has to show more change than is indicated by this range. So here we see with the pre-test of 58, we would expect the scores to fluctuate between 50 and 65 due to chance. The post-test score actually was 65, but we have to conclude that, you know what, I can account for that 7-point change by chance variation, and I have to conclude there's really been no change, no reliable or meaningful change on that score or that scale in this period of time. We see the same thing here in optimistic thinking and goal-directed behavior. However, in social awareness, this 9-point change in this post-test score of 69 is beyond this range. So we can conclude with confidence that he really has shown improvement in social awareness. And now he's like topping out the scale. A T-score of 69 is very high. Unfortunately, we can also sometimes see when a score significantly declines. So here the student began with a score of 48, but has actually gone down for whatever reason to 38. This would certainly draw our attention to decision making. But we also see there's been improvement in self-awareness, and overall we can conclude with the social emotional composite or kind of summary score that yes, in fact, the student has shown improvement in their social emotional competence over this period of time from October to February. So you can see if I'm the teacher, I can sit down with this data, see where I'm doing really well, see where maybe I need to do a little bit better in order to get to that significant increase, and maybe draw my attention to areas where this child is really apparently struggling a lot. Now I can aggregate that data across my entire school if I want to. And I could see, in this case, and this is real data by the way, that in this particular school from Anchorage, Alaska, beginning of the year, nearly 38% of the children in this elementary school had a need in the area of optimistic thinking. The principal called for an all-out effort on the part of his faculty and staff to promote optimism in the children. By the end of the year, not a single child was still showing a need in that area, and all of them were either now in the typical range or in the strength range. So this was a whole school kind of full court press on trying to promote optimism that had a lot of positive outcomes. Interestingly, this school also showed annual yearly progress for the first time in the same year that they did this approach focusing on optimism. Lastly, I just want to show you how this can be used on a more systematic basis. This is an elementary school, James Madison Elementary. I know there's a lot of data here, but what I show you is this column here, percentage of students in need for instruction at the pretest. These, by the way, are a somewhat different set of skills. There's a version of the DESSA which is geared to the second step curriculum. And if you use second step, you'll recognize these skills over here as being the skills that are taught in the second step program. So the DESSA has 8 skills. The DESSA second step edition has the 4 that are taught in the second step program. But the point is, if we look at the percentage of children in need at pretest, we see it's 20%, 10%, 20%. Wow, 33% of the kids at pretest had a need for instruction and problem solving. We then do our interventions, second step program, and other related interventions. We come in later in the year, and we see 50% of the children who had a need and skills for learning showed improvement. Empathy, though, was only 17%, but it was a smaller group to start with. But 79% of the kids with a need in emotion management and 70% with the kids with a need in problem solving showed a lot of improvement. So problem solving was a major issue for the school, but the teachers were highly effective in promoting those skills. They were highly effective in emotion management. Empathy was a smaller issue for them with only 10%, but a little bit less effectiveness. So maybe this is a target for quality improvement in the coming year. So maybe we want to do more mentoring, more coaching, go back and review the materials provided by Second Step on teaching empathy, etc. So you can see how you can utilize this data not just to improve outcomes for children and for classrooms, but even entire schools. And theoretically, you could aggregate these data at the district level. And again, the EVO platform allows you to do that different levels of aggregation. So our value proposition here for doing assessment along with social-emotional learning is now we can document the need for social-emotional learning programs with the mini by benchmarking against our national norms. We can better understand the unique strengths and needs of the students in our class and school building. We can better support the implementation of social-emotional learning programs by more specific implementation and focusing on the high need areas. We can monitor progress across the year. We can measure outcomes to guide continuous quality improvement. And in short, we can use assessment to support intentional teaching practice leading to improved outcomes for the student, and that's what this is all about. Finally, there are just a couple of references here if you want to learn more about this. Here's a chapter that my colleagues Jack Naglieri and Catherine Ross and I wrote that goes into all this in more detail. It's found in the book, Handbook of Resilience in Children. And lastly, here is the reference to a chapter this just came out within the last month or so. This is a great source of information on social-emotional learning, the Handbook of Social-Emotional Learning. Chapter 19 is on assessment of SEL in educational contexts by Suzanne Denham at George Mason University. And with that, Lori, I will stop and turn it back over to you.
Great, Paul. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I'll give you just a couple of moments to catch your breath, and then we'll take some Q&A from our attendees. So if you do have a question for Paul, please feel free to submit it now through that questions box of GoToWebinar. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. This webinar has been brought to you free today thanks to our sponsor, Apperson. School-based SEL programs are based on the idea that a student's academic success is linked to their ability to manage and regulate emotions, communicate and solve problems, and manage interpersonal conflicts. Social and emotional learning has been proven to decrease disruptive behavior, non-compliance, aggression, and disciplinary referrals. Technology offers tools that facilitate new ways to assess student learning. Apperson's EVO Social and Emotional Learning Assessment is a cloud-based version of the Devereaux Student Strengths Assessment, a two-part screener and assessment designed to help educators promote social-emotional development of students. Now, it includes the DESSA-mini, which is used to screen students, and the DESSA, which is administered to students who are identified as at risk for social emotional difficulties. So thanks again to Apperson for sponsoring our afternoon of learning today. And I just want to take a moment to pop back into the teacher learning community here at simpleK12.com, share with you where you can find some additional resources if you'd like to learn more. Underneath our courses tab, it's going to scroll down here to learning theories and strategies. Now we currently have over 40 unique webinar recordings specific to learning theories and strategies, so a great place to start if you are wanting some additional information and wanting to learn more. Also had several questions coming in regarding certificates of completion for PD points. Super easy to print those out for every full access member. When you log on to simpleK12.com, you'll see your member profile here in the upper right hand corner. So you'll click on your member profile, and then the next step is going to be that view transcript button. So we'll click on view transcript. Now you'll have two options once you get to this next page. You can choose a date range and you can print a summary report, or you can choose to print or download your certificate of completion individually. Keep in mind that it does take 48 hours for your transcript to update. When you attend a live webinar, your transcript does have to update. That takes 48 hours. However, there is a difference. When you watch those webinar recordings on demand, when you finish that on-demand webinar recording, you can go in and print those certificates of completion almost immediately. So there is that slight difference there. Now, in order to print certificates of completion for PD points, or to go back and watch any of the recordings of the sessions on demand, you would need to have that full access membership to the teacher learning community here at simpleK12.com. Now, we do have a very special offer for our attendees today, 50% off of the year membership price. I can stay on for a few minutes at the end of the session after we do some live Q&A with Paul, answer any questions that you may have regarding those full access memberships or about simpleK12 in general. Okay, Paul, I've got your contact information up here on my screen. Did have a few questions coming in here. First question came in from Erin. She says, how do you determine the post-test confidence range?
Good question, Erin. So there are two ways. If you're using the paper and pencil version of the DESSA, you go to an appendix in the technical manual, and it would give you that post-test confidence range for each pre-score on each of the 8 different social and emotional constructs measured by the DESSA. If you're using the EVO platform, it does it for you automatically. So you just identify your pre-test score, or actually you don't even identify the pre-test score, you just you pull up the pre-test rating, the post-test rating, you say do the pre-test, post-test comparison, click on a button, and it does everything for you automatically.
Okay, great. Paul, next question came in from Stephen. He says, how can we be sure that teaching the skills has a direct causal relationship to improvements?
Well, again, Stephen, that's a very good question. And, speaking as a researcher, the only way that you would really know for sure that it was your teaching that skill that resulted in that skill demonstration would be through doing some kind of research design with random assignment and control groups and those kinds of things. However, what we do know is that the good evidence-based programs do have that kind of research behind them that shows that when teachers deliver those strategies with fidelity and also with sufficient intensity, meaning enough repetitions and enough time, that it does result in the majority of cases in the acquisition of those skills. So I think Cheryl had shared with you the results, if you were on the previous webinar, of the Durlac meta-analysis where good SEL programs using experimental and quasi-experimental designs showed a 23% increase in social and emotional skills. So, you yourself may not know that it was specifically your instruction that did that, but we do know from the research literature that when teachers deliver these modules or these strategies with fidelity, that it does result in improvements in most children most of the time.
Okay, great, Paul. Next question from Kathy. She said, how frequently can the DESSA be done to show progress?
Well, because the ratings are based on the last 4 weeks, and you would not want to have overlapping periods, you could theoretically do it once a month. But that would really be, I think, an inordinate amount of work for a teacher to do. So if we're talking about the full DESSA, the 72-item DESSA, we would recommend that in a resource-rich school, that you might consider doing it 3 times per year. So you do it at the beginning of the year to get an idea of the child's strengths and needs. You'd implement your strategies, come in mid-year and do that pre-test, post-test comparison to see where you're being effective and where you could be more effective. And then modify your strategies and approaches for the spring semester, and then come in at the end of the year in a more summative fashion to document how you've done. With the mini, because it's only 1 minute per student, it's feasible to do it more frequently. So there, we would probably suggest that maybe every 60 to 90 days you could do a DESSA-mini if you're trying to chart the progress of kids. But if you really want to evaluate the effectiveness of your strategies at a more specific level, then you would do the DESSA.
Okay, great. Thanks, Paul. I did have another question from Andrea. She said, can you tell us the difference between the EVO system and the Compass Plus?
They're basically the same. So the original title that Apperson had given to the platform was Compass SEL, but for a number of reasons, they've modified the name to now be EVO SEL. So they're really the same thing, except that if you've used the previous Compass version or using it now, the EVO version, particularly with the release that's going to be coming out fairly soon, is going to have much more functionality than the earlier Compass system did. But essentially, they're the same thing.
Okay, great. Question from Spencer. I'm part of a virtual school. I have the parents complete the mini assessments. Many of my students have limited access to clubs and other groups due to their health. Do you think that other family members would be a good resource for more information? Do you have any other ideas for students in these situations?
There's a variety of good questions. I mean, certainly, getting input from parents is something that we encourage as much as possible. We think the more information we have on the student, then the more complete understanding we have, and the better the strategies we can promote. So we would certainly support the use of that. And by the way, we are going to be coming out with parent norms for the DESSA-mini. Currently, the mini is only normed on teachers, but there will be DESSA parent norms for the mini very soon. The full DESSA, we have parent and teachers, but the mini currently is only teachers, but we'll have parents soon. So yes, continue to use your parents as informants. In terms of getting strategies for children that can't participate in a lot of more typical activities, I might look at the National After School Association and see what kinds of resources they might have for children that have various kinds of challenges or limitations. And if you want to shoot me an email, I will be happy to look into that in more depth. But on the off the cuff, I think my first recommendation would be to go to the National After School Association and see what kinds of resources they might have.
Okay, great, Paul. I think we have time for one more question here. Which evidence-based SEL programs recommend the use of SEL assessments, or do they all?
Well, that's a very interesting question. A lot of, this is kind of a generality, a lot of universal SEL programs do not yet currently recommend the use of assessments in the way that we've been describing today. So they might talk about using assessments to measure outcomes and provide accountability, but using it to inform practice, we think, is taking it to kind of the next level. So the one that we partnered with in this area is the Second Step program by the Committee for Children. So they certainly are recommending and advocating for the use of assessment. But other SEL curricular programs really don't stress it as much as we believe. We believe that it has a lot more value that we're hoping to convince them that they can see. That was a bit of a roundabout answer. But currently, the short answer is the Committee for Children's Second Step program.
Okay, great. Paul, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. It's been a pleasure being here with you today, as always. I look forward to being back here with you again in about 30 minutes.